She walked into his mansion wearing torn jeans and no fear. He was the most dangerous mafia boss in New York, a man who ended lives without hesitation. She was the daughter of his housekeeper, a woman running from a violent past she thought she had buried forever. He told her to wear the uniform. She told him no. He told her to remember her place. She told him to remember his manners. And somewhere between the threats and the tension, something happened that neither of them expected. But when his jealous fiancé publicly humiliated her, when her darkest secret was exposed in front of hundreds of powerful guests, and when the ghost of her abusive ex-husband showed up at the gates demanding to see her, everything changed. This is a story about a woman who refused to break, and the ruthless man who would burn his entire empire down just to keep her safe. Stay until the very end, because the ending will leave you speechless. This story will remind you that your past does not define your future, that real strength is not about never falling, it is about standing back up when the whole world expects you to stay down, and that sometimes love finds you in the most dangerous and unexpected places. "You cannot be serious, Mom," Isabella Reyes said, her voice tight. One hand clutched her phone, while the other desperately searched through an open suitcase. "I have been home for one day after 3 years, and you want me to clean a mob boss's house?" On the phone, Rosa Reyes sounded weak, her words strained with sickness and anxiety. Her pneumonia was severe. A doctor had insisted on a full week of absolute rest. "It is just for a little while, my love," Rosa whispered. "The Castellano family has employed me for 2 decades. I cannot abandon them during their big event." Isabella held back a frustrated scream. She was 27. She had a nursing degree. She had spent 3 years escaping a violent man who had nearly broken her. The absolute last thing she needed was to walk back into that kind of danger. But the image of her mother, sick and vulnerable in their small Brooklyn apartment, was more persuasive than any argument. An old scar on her shoulder began to ache, a phantom pain that was a constant memory of what happens when you trust the wrong kind of man. "Is there nobody else?" Isabella asked, her last attempt at escape, already knowing the answer. "They know us, Bella. No one understands that house the way we do. They have faith in me. In us." Isabella glanced through the window. Far away, the lights of Manhattan shimmered, a perfect symbol of the immense gap between her life and the world of the Castellanos. "All right," she finally surrendered. "But I will not wear that awful uniform. They can have my help, but I will do it my way." Rosa began to protest, her words broken by coughing. "Bella, please." "My way, Mom, or not at all. The girl who fled 3 years ago is gone." The quiet that followed on the line was the only confirmation she required. A small smile touched Isabella's lips. She had won the first round. She was completely unaware that this one decision, walking through the doors of the Castellano estate, would alter the course of her entire life. She did not know that the ruthless mafia leader, a man who answered to no one, was about to be captivated by a woman with torn jeans and a will made of steel. The next day, a cab dropped her at the foot of the Castellano property. She got out, threw a worn backpack over her shoulder, and was momentarily paralyzed by the sight of the colossal black iron gates that stood before her. Her clothes for the day had been a deliberate choice: faded blue jeans with rips in the knees, a simple white shirt knotted at her midriff, showing a sliver of skin, old, comfortable sneakers. Her dark hair was down, and she wore no makeup beyond a touch of lip balm. This was a statement, not a uniform. 2 guards in dark suits watched her approach the gate, their expressions filled with distrust. "What is your business here?" one asked, his tone flat and rude. Isabella looked him straight in the eye, refusing to be intimidated. "My name is Isabella Reyes. I am Rosa's daughter, here to cover my mother's shifts for the week." The man's eyebrow went up as his gaze raked over her again. "You certain you have the right address?" he sneered. "The help does not look like you." A flash of fury burned inside Isabella, but she controlled it, letting only a cold smile form on her lips. I have no idea how your staff normally presents themselves. I dress for myself. So either you call the house to verify my story, or I leave and inform my mother that the Castellanos are on their own. Her directness clearly surprised him. He paused, looked at the other guard, and then grudgingly picked up a phone. A few silent, tense moments later, the massive gates began to creak open. Isabella walked past them, feeling their hostile eyes on her back the entire time. A driveway of white gravel wound through a perfect landscape: manicured lawns, flawless rose bushes, marble statues placed with precision. Isabella kept her expression neutral, but her mind was spinning. Her mother spent her life in this place. She had never pictured this level of wealth. Ahead, the main house stood like a palace, a grand Italian villa with towering white pillars, intricate iron railings, and a huge door of solid oak. As Isabella reached the top of the marble stairs, the door swung inward before she could touch it. A woman with silver hair pulled back tightly stood in the doorway. Her face was stern, etched with lines of authority. She was dressed in a dark suit, her posture ramrod straight. "You are the daughter of Rosa," she announced, her eyes flicking over Isabella's outfit with disapproval. "My name is Margaret Stone. You will call me Maggie. I am in charge of this house." Isabella gave a small nod. "I am Isabella. My mother has mentioned you." Maggie offered no pleasantries in return. She simply moved out of the way. "This way. The master requires a word with you before you start." Isabella crossed the threshold and felt the world shift. The entry hall was cavernous. The ceiling was a canvas of detailed paintings. A colossal crystal fixture dominated this space, throwing fractured light onto the polished marble below. The walls were covered in art, each piece in a golden frame, probably costing more than her entire apartment building. Isabella swallowed hard, fighting to keep her composure. She trailed Maggie down long hallways, the sound of her own shoes loud on the stone floors. She noticed men in suits posted in the shadows of doorways. She saw the distinct shape of firearms under their coats. This was not just money. This was something else entirely. Her mother's rules echoed in her mind. Do not ask about their work. Do not look where you are not invited. Do not repeat what you overhear. At the far end of a hall, Maggie paused at a large wooden door. She faced Isabella, her face a blank mask. "The master does not appreciate defiance," the housekeeper stated softly. "Consider your appearance and your words carefully." Isabella's smile was sharp. "I am here as an employee, not as a servant." Maggie's gaze lingered on her for a second, before she sighed and knocked once on the door. A low voice from within answered, "Enter." Maggie opened the door and gestured for Isabella to go in. "Mr. Castellano," she announced. "Isabella Reyes, the daughter of Rosa, is here." Taking a steadying breath, Isabella walked into the room, having no idea that she had just crossed a line from which she could never return. The office was vast. 3 walls were lined with towering, ornate bookshelves. A huge desk made of dark wood sat in the center. A wall of glass looked out onto the gardens behind the house. But the room's grandeur vanished when she finally saw him. Maxwell Castellano was focused on a pile of paperwork, his head propped on one hand. A powerfully built older man stood near him, clearly a bodyguard. 2 more guards stood like sculptures in the corners. Max did not acknowledge her entrance. He just kept reading, treating her as if she were invisible. Isabella planted her feet in the center of the room and waited, refusing to bow her head. She observed him. His dark hair was combed back, showing a face with hard angles and a strong jaw. A thin scar traced a path from his temple down toward his mouth. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the neck, the sleeves pushed up to his forearms. She could see the edge of a dark tattoo on his collarbone. He was just sitting and reading, yet a palpable sense of power radiated from him, making the room feel strangely small and suffocating. This was the man my mother had worked for 2 decades, she realized. The one they whispered about, who ended lives without a second thought. After what felt like an eternity of silence, Max finally raised his head, his cold gray eyes locked with hers, and he stopped, completely. The pen in his hand hovered over the paper. For a fraction of a second, his eyes went wide. Then, his gaze slowly moved down, taking in her face, her shoulders, the knot in her shirt, the tears in her jeans, and her old shoes. When his eyes met hers again, she saw a brief, unreadable spark in their depths. It was enough to make her pulse jump. Max placed the pen on the desk and leaned back, his stare intense and unbroken. "You are the daughter of Rosa," he stated, his voice a low gravel. It was not a question. Isabella nodded once. "Yes, I am Isabella Reyes. I am filling in for my mother." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze sweeping over her clothing with an unreadable look. Finally, he spoke, his voice as cold as a tombstone. "I am glad you are here to help your mother, but this house has rules you are required to follow. That begins with wearing the uniform." A fire ignited in Isabella's chest, but she kept her tone perfectly level. "Good morning to you too, Mr. Castellano. I must inform you that I will not be wearing any uniform. My mother might agree to that, but I will not." A heavy silence consumed the room. The huge guard standing next to Max, a man Isabella would soon know as Tony, stared at her like she had lost her mind. The two men in the corner shared a look of pure shock. Nobody talked to Don Castellano like that. Nobody was that brave. Max rose slowly from his chair, and it was only then that Isabella saw just how tall he was. He moved around his desk, and every footstep on the hardwood floor sounded like a drumbeat before a battle. He came to a stop just inches from her, looking down at her with eyes of ice. "Do you have any idea who you are speaking to?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Isabella tilted her chin up and met his gray gaze without flinching, even though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I do," she answered with a steady voice. "You are Maxwell Castellano, my mother's boss, the man she has served for 20 years of her life. But I am not my mother. I am here to do a job, not to be a decoration in a costume. If that is a problem for you, I will leave this instant and you can hire someone else." Max's brow furrowed, and Isabella noticed the scar on his face twitch. He examined her as if he was trying to see into her soul. For a brief second, his eyes fell to her shoulder where her shirt had slipped, showing a small piece of an old scar. His gray eyes went dark for a moment, but he did not mention it. Instead, he looked over at Tony and the other two men. "Leave," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "All of you, I need a private word with her." Tony started to say something, but then he shut his mouth. He simply nodded and walked the other men out, closing the door quietly behind them. Isabella was now by herself with the most infamous mafia boss in all of New York. She wondered if she had just made the smartest decision of her life, or the most foolish one. As soon as the door clicked shut, the room filled with a thick silence. Max remained where he was, standing less than a foot from Isabella, his cold, gray eyes locked on hers without a single blink. Isabella could smell his cologne, a scent of sandalwood with a dangerous note she could not identify. She held her breath, waiting, unsure of what would come next. Then, without a word, Max turned away and went to the window. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the garden below. "You have courage," he stated, his voice much calmer than Isabella was expecting. "It has been a very long time since anyone has dared to talk to me in that manner." Isabella replied instantly, "Maybe that is because no one is brave enough to tell you what is true." Max turned around, and the corner of his mouth lifted just a fraction. It was not a smile, but it was no longer a threat. He went to his desk and poured a glass of whiskey. He raised it, but did not drink, just swirled the liquid slowly in his hand. "A very important event is happening in a few days," he said, his focus still on the glass. "It is the launch of my family's new line of premium wine. Every detail has to be flawless. Your mother is the only one who knows this house inside and out, who knows what every single guest prefers." He finally looked up at Isabella. And she is now in the hospital. I do not have the time to find someone to replace her. Isabella saw her opening. So you need me? She asked bluntly. Max put his glass down, and his eyes grew sharp. I do not need anyone, but I will concede that your presence right now is necessary. There is a distinction. Isabella let out a small, humorless laugh. Call it what you want, but if you expect me to stay and do the work you require, we have to renegotiate the terms. Max lifted an eyebrow. Renegotiate? Isabella nodded and took a step toward his desk. She knew she was tempting fate, but she had spent 3 years escaping a violent husband. She was not afraid of anything anymore. First, I will not wear a uniform, she declared, her voice strong and clear. Second, I will do my work my own way, as long as the job meets your standards. And third, she paused, looking him straight in the eye. I want double my mother's salary. Max just stared at her, his stone-like expression revealing nothing at all. A few moments of tense quiet passed. Then, he laughed. It was a low, rough sound that filled the entire space. It was the first time Isabella had heard him laugh, and it caught her off guard. You are negotiating with me, he said, a note of surprise in his voice. In my own home, for a job as a housekeeper. Isabella stood her ground. I am giving you fair conditions for a task you have already said is essential. If you do not accept, I can walk out of that door this second. Max tilted his head, observing her like she was some rare animal he had never seen before. Then he gave a slow nod. Fine, he said. Just like that. Double the pay. No uniform. You can do things your way. But then he stepped in closer, his voice dropping to a low whisper. If a single thing at this party is not perfect, you will answer for it. And I am not a man who forgives. Isabella swallowed hard but held his stare. I do not want your forgiveness. I just need you to honor your word. Max watched her for another long moment. Then he moved back and hit the intercom button on his desk. Maggie, he said into the speaker, please take Miss Reyes and brief her on the work. She is taking Rose's place for the week. He paused, and his eyes flicked toward Isabella. And she will not require a uniform. Maggie's voice came over the speaker, sounding surprised but professional. Yes, sir. Max sat down again and grabbed his papers as if their talk was finished. But right as Isabella started to leave, she heard him speak behind her. You are an interesting woman, Isabella Reyes. She did not look back. She just gave a small smile to herself and left the room, her heart racing in her chest. She had won this round, but she knew, deep down, that the real fight was just getting started. Maggie walked Isabella through the grand house, explaining each space in a dull, flat tone. The kitchen was the size of a professional restaurant, full of shiny stainless steel appliances. The main living room was big enough for 100 guests, with sofas made of cream-colored leather and a huge marble fireplace. The banquet hall in the basement was even bigger, with stone pillars and a dark wood floor so polished it shined like a mirror. Isabella absorbed it all, her mind working like a computer. 3 years as a nurse had taught her to notice every little thing, to organize tasks with precision, and to stay calm under pressure. When Maggie gave her the to-do list for the party, Isabella read it once and nodded. I will require 2 more helpers to clean the banquet hall, she informed Maggie. And the chandelier fixtures must be cleaned again. I can spot dust on the upper sections. Maggie's eyebrows shot up with surprise, but she did not argue. She just nodded and wrote it down. For the rest of the day, Isabella worked non-stop. She rearranged the storage for guest supplies, inspected every single crystal glass for chips, created a new list of items to be restocked, and gave it to Maggie. She was fast and efficient, never complaining, and never wasting a single second. The other staff members watched her with suspicion at first, but by the evening, they were following her instructions as if it were natural. In his office, Max sat at his desk, the business reports completely forgotten. He was watching the security camera feed, following Isabella's every move. He watched her in the banquet hall, giving orders as others set up tables and chairs. Her face was focused and intense. He watched her pick up a glass, holding it to the light to look for any streaks before nodding in approval. He watched her pull back her long, dark hair when it fell in her face, and he asked himself why he could not look away. She was different from any woman he had ever known. She was not scared, she was not obedient, and she was not trying to impress him. She treated him like he was just another person, not the feared mafia boss of the entire city. It was something that both annoyed and fascinated him. Max leaned back in his chair, his gaze still fixed on the monitor, but his thoughts drifted to the past. He thought of his brother, Jonathan, the man who was supposed to be in his position now. Jonathan was 3 years older, tall and powerful, born to take over the Castellano family business. Max, however, had only ever wanted to be a doctor. He remembered long nights studying in his medical school dorm, surrounded by heavy anatomy textbooks, dreaming of saving people, not hurting them. He had been in his final year, just months away from his degree. Then he saw Jonathan get shot and killed right in front of him, ambushed by a rival family. Max could still feel his brother's blood on his hands. He could still hear Jonathan's last struggling breath. He could still see his brother's eyes, trying to say a final goodbye without words. On that day, Maxwell Castellano, the medical student who dreamed of healing, ceased to exist. In his place was Don Castellano, a cold man who never pardoned and never forgot. He hunted down Jonathan's killers one by one, showing no mercy. And he buried his dream of being a doctor right alongside his brother. Max blinked, forcing himself back to the here and now. On the screen, Isabella was smiling at an older maid. It was the first time he had seen her smile since she got there. The expression softened her sharp features, making her seem younger and more approachable. Deep inside Max's chest, a feeling he thought had been buried for years began to stir. He quickly shut off the monitor and went back to his paperwork, trying to erase Isabella's face from his thoughts. But the faint scent of her perfume still lingered in his office, and he knew it was going to be a very long night. The second day flew by, much quicker than Isabella anticipated. She had settled into the estate's routine, finally grasping how the place operated. That morning, while she was taking inventory of the wine in the cellar, the sound of a car's engine broke the quiet in the courtyard. Isabella paid it no mind, figuring it was just another visitor. But when she returned to the main living area to check the freshly polished crystal glasses, she froze. A woman stood in the middle of the room. Her golden hair was perfectly curled, her makeup flawless, and her slender frame was poured into a tight, expensive red dress. Her arms were wrapped around Max's neck, her crimson lips brushing against his cheek. Max just stood there, his body rigid, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides, as if he had no idea what to do with them. "Darling," the woman's voice was high and sugary. "I missed you terribly. Why didn't you call me all week?" Max gently pried her hands off him, his face a cold mask. "Vanessa," he said, his tone flat. "I have been busy with the event preparations." Vanessa's lips formed a slight pout. "Too busy for your fiancé." Isabella felt a shock, like a bucket of icy water had been dumped over her head. His fiancé. The thought was a bitter pill. Of course, a man like Maxwell Castellano would not be unattached. She started to back away quietly, but Vanessa turned, and her cold blue eyes locked onto Isabella's. Her gaze raked over Isabella from head to toe, taking in her simple tied-back black hair, her plain white shirt, and jeans. "Who is this?" Vanessa asked, her voice syrupy sweet, but with a sharp, chilling edge that made Isabella shiver. Max glanced toward Isabella, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something in his gray eyes before it disappeared. "This is Isabella Reyes," he stated calmly. "Rosa's daughter. She is filling in for her mother this week." Vanessa's eyebrow arched, her stare remaining fixed on Isabella. "Oh, the maid's daughter," she said with a slow drawl. I was under the impression that the staff wore uniforms. Why is she dressed like she's one of the guests? A surge of anger rose in Isabella's chest, but she pushed it down and managed a polite smile. I am not a servant, ma'am. I am just helping my mother while she is unwell. Vanessa moved closer, her expensive, sharp perfume overwhelming Isabella's senses. She was slightly taller in her high heels, a fact she used to look down on Isabella with open disdain. Whatever you are, Vanessa whispered, her voice low enough for only Isabella to hear. You need to remember your place. Do not get any ideas just because you have a pretty face. Do not look at things that are not yours. Isabella met Vanessa's gaze without wavering. I have no idea what you are referring to, she answered calmly. I am here to do a job, not to look at anything. Vanessa let out a short, sharp laugh, but her eyes were like chips of ice. Good, she said. Keep it that way. She then pivoted back to Max, her sweet smile reappearing as if their tense exchange had never occurred. Darling, she cooed, winding her arm possessively through his. I want to see everything you have planned for the party. My father is so excited about this event. Max gave a slight nod, but his gaze darted back to Isabella one last time before he let Vanessa guide him down the hallway. Isabella stood frozen, watching them until they disappeared from sight. She could not understand the ache in her chest, or why it mattered to her that Maxwell Castellano was engaged. She was just the maid's daughter, here for a few days before she would be gone. She had no claim, no right to have any feelings for the head of a crime family. But as she went back to her tasks, the image of Vanessa's arm linked with Max's played over and over in her mind. That afternoon, Vanessa decided to stay for dinner. She made herself at home in the living room, sipping wine and issuing orders as if she were already the lady of the manor. Isabella did her best to stay out of her way, focusing on the preparations for the big event, but Vanessa seemed determined to provoke her. You there! Vanessa called out sharply as Isabella walked through the living room with a stack of clean tablecloths. Come here. Isabella paused, taking a deep, steadying breath before walking over to her. Yes. What can I help you with? She asked, her tone polite but distant. Vanessa's eyes scanned her from top to bottom with undisguised contempt. Pour me another glass of wine, she commanded, sliding her empty glass toward Isabella. Isabella glanced at the glass, then back at Vanessa. There are staff in the kitchen, she replied evenly. I am busy preparing for the event. Vanessa's eyes narrowed, her red lips tightening into a thin line. I told you to pour me some wine. Are you deaf? Isabella placed the tablecloths on a nearby table, walked to the wine cabinet, and poured a glass of red wine. She set it down in front of Vanessa, struggling to maintain her composure as her anger simmered. Vanessa picked up the glass, took a small sip, and then, without warning, threw the contents all over Isabella. The cold, red liquid soaked through her white shirt, chilling her skin. Isabella stood in stunned silence, unable to process what had just happened. Oh, my apologies, Vanessa said, her voice dripping with fake sincerity. My hand must have slipped. But it is no big deal. You are used to getting messy, are you not? Just like your mother, who has spent her entire life on her knees scrubbing floors for other people. Isabella's hands balled into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She felt the blood rush to her face, a furious ringing in her ears. But she forced herself to stand there and take it, thinking of her mother and the 20 years she had worked in this house. Seeing Isabella's silence only seemed to fuel Vanessa's cruelty. She stood up and stepped closer, her voice laced with more venom. I heard your mother is sick, she sneered. It is probably because she has worked her fingers to the bone like a common servant until her body gave out. How pathetic. 20 years of bowing and scraping. And for what? To end up as a useless old maid. Something inside Isabella snapped. She could tolerate any insult directed at her, but she would not stand for anyone speaking about her mother that way. Before she could think, Isabella's hand shot out and connected with Vanessa's flawless cheek in a loud, sharp slap. The sound echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. Vanessa stumbled backward, her hand flying to her cheek, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. You! You hit me! She shrieked. Do you have any idea who I am? Isabella stood tall, her chest heaving with rage, her voice as cold as steel. She hit me, Maxwell. Max ignored Vanessa, his gaze fixed on Isabella. Tony, he repeated, his voice colder this time. Do as I said. Tony nodded and, with a gentle but firm grip, escorted Vanessa out of the room, her shrill protests fading down the hall. Once they were alone, Max walked toward Isabella. Follow me, he said curtly, turning and heading down the corridor. After a moment of hesitation, Isabella followed him. He led her into his study and shut the door behind them. She stood there, steeling herself for his wrath. But instead, Max just looked at her with an unreadable expression. He opened a drawer, pulled out a new, still-packaged white shirt, and handed it to her. Change your shirt, he said simply. The wine will irritate your skin if you leave it on for too long. Isabella stared at the shirt, then at him, completely baffled. Are you not going to punish me? She asked. Max turned his back to her and looked out the window. Next time, do not leave a handprint on her face, he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. It makes things difficult to explain to the Thornon family. Isabella stood there, stunned, staring at his broad back. And for the first time since she had arrived, a feeling of warmth spread through her chest. That night, Isabella lay awake in the small bed in the servants' quarters, unable to sleep. Her mind replayed the day's events over and over, from the slap she had given Vanessa to Max's completely unexpected reaction. She could not figure him out. She did not understand why he had not punished her, or the strange look in his eyes when he had given her the shirt. When the clock chimed 2 in the morning, Isabella finally gave up on sleep. She slipped on a light cardigan and crept out of her room. The mansion was dark and silent, with only a few dim lights illuminating the long corridors. She did not have a destination in mind, simply letting her feet guide her through the empty halls until she found herself standing before the door to the wine cellar. She paused for a moment before deciding to go inside. The spiral stone staircase led her down into a vast, cool space filled with endless rows of oak shelves. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and rich wine. Isabella walked slowly, her fingertips brushing against the dusty bottles, each one a silent testament to the history of the Castellano family. She stopped short when she saw a figure at the far end of the cellar. Max was sitting alone in an old leather chair, an open bottle of wine on a small table next to him, a glass of deep red liquid in his hand. But it was not his presence that surprised her. It was the book he was holding. Even in the dim light, she recognized it as a medical textbook, the kind she was intimately familiar with from her nursing studies. Cannot sleep either? Max's voice cut through the silence, making Isabella jump. He did not look up from his book, but it was clear he had been aware of her presence for a while. With no reason to hide, Isabella walked closer. I could say the same to you, she replied. Max finally raised his head, his gray eyes meeting hers in the shadowy room. He looked more tired than he had during the day, the lines around his eyes more pronounced. His usual cold demeanor was gone, replaced by something that looked like sorrow. I have not slept well for many nights, he said, his voice rough. Not since Jonathan died. Isabella remembered Maggie mentioning the name. He was Max's brother, the one who was supposed to inherit the Castellano Empire. She sat down in the chair across from him, remaining quiet, waiting for him to continue. Max watched her for a long moment before holding up the book. This was my brother's, he said. Jonathan collected medical books, even though he never wanted to be a doctor. He said they helped him understand the human body, where to, how to inflict the greatest agony. A bitter, joyless chuckle escaped him. But I was the one who actually wanted to use that knowledge for healing. Isabella watched him, and everything started to make sense. You were a medical student, she said, making a statement instead of asking a question. Max gave a slow nod. I was in my last year of medical school, just a few months from graduating. Then I saw Jonathan get shot right in front of me, and I had to come back to take his place. He spoke with a steady voice, like he was recounting a story about a stranger. But Isabella could see the profound hurt in his gray eyes. She recognized that feeling. The pain of losing someone you love and carrying an emptiness that never goes away. I lost my brother as well, she said, her voice quiet and unsteady, even after so many years. His name was Miguel. He was 16. He was killed in a motorcycle crash while making deliveries to support our family. He died in my arms. Max looked at her and, for the first time, his expression was completely unguarded. How old were you at the time? He asked. 18, Isabella answered. It happened the day before my birthday. I have not celebrated with candles ever since. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They were two people from opposite worlds, connected in that moment by a shared sorrow. Max filled a glass with wine and pushed it across to her. She accepted it, taking a small sip, noticing the flavors of ripe grapes and oak. Jonathan would have enjoyed your company, Max mentioned out of nowhere. He admired people who showed courage. I am not without fear, she replied with honesty. I have just spent so much of my life being scared that I no longer have the energy for it. Max looked at her with a peculiar expression, as if her words had struck a chord deep inside him. They stayed there until the wine was gone, talking about the people they had lost, their forgotten dreams, and their hidden scars. As the first light of dawn filtered through the cellar door, Isabella knew she had witnessed a side of Maxwell Castellano no one else saw, a man whose cold demeanor masked deep, unhealed wounds. That realization scared her more than anything. The morning light grew brighter as Max abruptly put his glass down and looked directly at Isabella. That scar on your shoulder? He said, his tone quiet but insistent. I noticed it on your first day here. Who gave that to you? Isabella went rigid. Her hand moved instinctively toward her shoulder, where the long mark was concealed by her clothing. She was accustomed to concealing it, to acting like it was not there. But a strange patience filled Max's gray eyes, as though he would wait all day for her to speak. That is in the past, she said softly, trying to change the subject. It is no one's business. Max remained silent, his gaze never leaving her. His quiet stare was more demanding than any question could be. Isabella could feel the defenses she had built for 3 years starting to crumble. Maybe it was because they had revealed so much to each other that night. Or perhaps she was simply exhausted from holding it all inside. My former husband, she finally admitted. Her voice shook just a little, no matter how hard she tried to keep it steady. His name is Derek Manning. We got married when I was 22 and divorced 2 years after that. Max's brow furrowed, and the scar on his face tightened. He was abusive, he stated, not as a question, but as a statement filled with rage. Isabella gave a slow nod, her gaze falling to the empty wine glass. It began with just words, she explained, her voice even, as if describing someone else's life. Then it became slaps, and then it became beatings. I got this scar when he threw me against the corner of a glass table. It required 12 stitches to close. Max's fist tightened so hard his knuckles went white. Where is he now? He asked, his voice like ice, with a quiet rage building inside him. Isabella just shook her head. I have no idea. After we divorced, I fled to Chicago and severed every connection. For 3 years, I lived as if I did not exist. No online presence, no contact with old friends, nothing. I was terrified he would track me down. She met Max's gaze, and he saw in her dark brown eyes not fragility, but a strength that had been hardened by pain. But I am done running, she declared, her voice gaining strength. I returned to New York for my mother, and I refuse to let anyone, especially Derek, force me out of my own life ever again. Max studied her for a long time, his gray eyes swirled with feelings she could not decipher. Then he rose to his feet and moved toward her. Isabella expected him to say something, but he just extended his hand, palm facing up, in a silent gesture. "Let us go upstairs," he said with a soft voice. "Morning is here, and you should get some sleep." Isabella glanced at his hand, paused for a moment, and then put her hand in his. Max's hand was warm and firm, and his fingers wrapped around hers with an unexpected tenderness. He guided her up the staircase and through the dark hallways until they reached her room. "Get some sleep," he murmured. "Do not worry about a thing." Isabella nodded before stepping into the room. When she looked back to offer her thanks, the door was shut, and Max was gone. She had no idea that as soon as he was out of sight, Max pulled out his phone and dialed Tony. His voice was deadly and cold as he issued the command. "I want all the information you can find on a man named Derek Manning. He is Isabella Reyes's former husband. I need his location, his job, every detail about him, and I need it by sunset today." Tony, on the other end of the line, asked no questions. After 2 decades with the Castellanos, he understood when to simply follow orders. "Yes, sir," Tony said. "I will get on it right away." Max hung up and stood alone in the shadowed corridor, his gaze locked on Isabella's door. He could not explain why her story had stirred such a deep rage within him. He did not understand why the idea of anyone harming her made him want to destroy that person himself. All he knew was that Derek Manning, no matter where he was hiding, was about to discover that he had made a terrible mistake. Later that day, Isabella requested a few hours off from Maggie to go see her mother. She had to see Rosa, to listen to her talk, and to find the calm that only her mother provided. The last few days had been filled with too much turmoil. Between Vanessa and the nights spent with Max in the cellar, she felt like she was losing her footing. The little apartment in Brooklyn was exactly as she recalled, small but welcoming, with family pictures on the walls and the comforting smell of cooking. Rosa's health had improved significantly. Her complexion was better, although she still had a cough now and then. "My dear girl," Rosa said with a smile as Isabella walked in. "Come and sit with me. Tell me everything that is happening at the Castellano estate." Isabella settled next to her mother on the old couch, leaning her head on Rosa's shoulder, just like when she was a little girl. She talked about her duties, the event that was coming up, and about Maggie and the rest of the staff. She left out any mention of Vanessa, the slap, and definitely the time she spent with Max in the wine cellar. But Rosa knew her daughter. She could hear the things left unspoken. "Is there something on your mind?" Rosa asked softly as she smoothed her daughter's hair. Isabella paused, then shook her head. "It is nothing, Mom. I am just feeling worn out." Rosa let out a sigh, her eyes looking far away. "I can tell you are keeping something from me," she said. "But that is fine. You are entitled to your own secrets. It is just that I believe it is time for me to share one that I have held for 20 years. Isabella raised her head, surprised. "What kind of secret?" Rosa shut her eyes for a second, mustering her strength. When she looked up again, Isabella could see tears forming in the corners of her eyes. "It concerns your father," Rosa said with a waver in her voice. "And it explains why I have been employed by the Castellanos for 2 decades. Isabella went still. Her father, Ricardo Reyes, was the man who had abandoned them when she was just 5 years old, leaving her mother to bring up 2 children alone in poverty. Her only memories of him were from old photographs and the sound of her mother weeping in the kitchen late at night. "Did you know that your father used to work for the Castellanos?" Rosa inquired. Isabella shook her head in disbelief. "I had no idea." "You never said anything." Rosa gave a slow nod. "Your father was the private driver for Mr. Castellano, Maxwell's father. He was a trusted and respected employee, but he started gambling and lost a fortune. He took money from loan sharks, and when he could not pay them back, he did something that could not be forgiven." Isabella's heart began to pound with a growing sense of dread. "What did he end up doing?" she asked in a strained voice. Rosa swallowed hard, and tears rolled down her cheeks. To settle his debts, your father took money from the Castellanos. It was a very large amount. When they found out, he should have lost his life. But I got on my knees and pleaded with Mr. Castellano to let him live. He consented, but with one condition. Your father had to vanish completely, and I had to work to pay back what he took. Isabella felt like all the oxygen had been stolen from the room. 20 years, she breathed. You have worked for 20 years to clear his debt. Rosa nodded as the tears continued to fall. I hold no resentment toward your father, she explained. My only wish was to keep you and your brother safe. I never wanted you to be raised under the influence of that life. I did all of it so that you could have a regular life, get an education, and build a future for yourself. Isabella got up and walked a few paces, holding onto the window frame for support. For all those years, she thought her mother's hard labor was just a result of being poor, that they had no other way. She never knew Rosa was shouldering a crushing debt that should have been her father's burden. Every sacrifice her mother made, every night she returned with cracked hands and an aching spine, was for the man who had vanished without a trace. Why did you never tell me? Isabella asked, her voice cracking as she turned to face her. Why did you carry this by yourself for 20 years? Rosa stood up and pulled her into an embrace. Because you are my daughter, she whispered. I would do anything to keep you safe. At that moment, Isabella finally shattered. For the first time in years, she wept like a small child in her mother's arms. She wept for the 2 decades of Rosa's silent struggle, for her brother who was gone, for her own failed marriage, and for the 5-year-old girl who once waited by the window for a father who never came back. Rosa just held her close, stroking her hair like she always had. Everything is going to be okay, she murmured. We still have one another. That is all that truly matters. When Isabella returned to the Castellano estate that evening, her eyes were still puffy and red. She had cried the entire afternoon away in her mother's embrace, and now she felt empty, like a vessel completely drained. Her plan was to sneak to her room unnoticed, hoping no one would see her in this state. But the moment she walked through the front door, a youthful voice stopped her. Oh, you have to be Isabella, right? Isabella looked over and saw a young woman standing at the base of the grand staircase. She appeared to be around 20, with dark brown hair chopped to her shoulders and gray eyes that were exactly like Max's, but so much warmer. Dressed in a baggy hoodie and worn jeans, she looked more like a typical college student than the sister of a powerful mafia boss. I am Sophia, the girl said, moving closer with a radiant smile. Maxwell's sister. He mentions you a lot. Isabella was taken aback. He talks about me? Sophia let out a little laugh. Yes, in his own way. He is not a man of many words, but I have learned to read what he doesn't say. He told me someone new was working here. Someone stubborn who was not afraid of anyone. I knew immediately that he was talking about someone important. Isabella had no idea how to respond. She had never encountered anyone in the Castellano family who was so welcoming. Sophia was the complete opposite of Max's cold demeanor and the formal distance of everyone else in the house. Are you all right? Sophia asked, her tone suddenly shifting to serious. Your eyes are really red. Isabella wanted to lie, but she could only manage to shake her head. Today was a little difficult, she confessed. Sophia nodded with empathy, and then, without warning, took Isabella's hand. Come with me, she insisted, leading her toward the kitchen. There is nothing a cup of hot chocolate cannot fix. They sat in the kitchen for almost an hour, sipping the warm drink and talking about everything. Sophia talked about studying law, about her ambition to become an attorney who protected the rights of children, and about how much she despised the shadow cast by the Castellano name, even though she loved her brother without condition. As Isabella listened, she felt the weight on her chest begin to lift. There was an ease about Sophia that made her feel secure, like she had discovered a real friend in this strange new world. Max has changed so much since you arrived, Sophia said out of the blue. I visit home all the time, and I have never seen him act this way. He is softer, less guarded. I have no idea what you did, but thank you. Isabella was about to argue when Maggie came into the kitchen. She stopped when she saw them, and a faint, rare smile touched her stern lips. Sophia is right, Maggie confirmed, her voice gentler than usual. I have been here for 20 years, since Max was just a boy. I watched him build the cold walls around himself after Jonathan's death. But over the last few days, I have noticed something different in him, and I think that difference is you. Isabella's heart started to beat faster. She did not know what to say or how she should feel. Sophia gave her hand a reassuring squeeze and smiled. You are going to stay, are you not? After the wine launch event, you will stay here. Isabella's mind raced. She thought of her mother, of the 20-year debt, and the agonizing past she had just unearthed. She thought about Derek and the terror that had stalked her for 3 years. Then she thought of Max, of his gray eyes that seemed so cold but concealed a pain that mirrored her own. She had been on the run for too long. From Derek, from her past, from herself. Maybe it was finally time to stand still and face everything. I will stay, Isabella said, her voice stronger than it had been in years, at least until I figure things out. Sophia cheered and wrapped her in a tight hug. Maggie simply gave a nod, but Isabella saw a flicker of hope in the older woman's eyes that she had not seen for a very long time. The day of the wine launch finally came. The Castellano estate had been transformed into a vision of elegance. The banquet hall was illuminated by thousands of candles, decorated with arrangements of white roses, and filled with the soft classical music of a live orchestra. Isabella had been overseeing the final preparations since early that morning. She checked everything from the arrangement of the tables and chairs to the precise placement of the rare wine bottles. She needed everything to be perfect, not just for the sake of her job, but to prove to herself that she was capable. In the afternoon, while Isabella was reviewing the guest list for the last time, Sophia suddenly appeared and pulled her into a nearby room. You are not wearing jeans to the party tonight, Sophia said with excitement. Max has invited you as his guest. Isabella stood frozen. What? I am just a temporary employee. I cannot accept. Sophia waved her hand dismissively. His mind is made up, and once Maxwell Castellano decides something, nobody can change it. Besides, I already have a dress for you to wear. Before Isabella had a chance to argue, Sophia presented a long black dress from the wardrobe. The design was simple but stunning, featuring a bateau neckline, long sleeves made of sheer lace that hugged the bodice, and a hem that flared out gently. I bought this for a university gala but never had the chance to wear it, Sophia told her. We are the same size, so it should fit you perfectly. Isabella stared at the dress, then looked at Sophia as a lump formed in her throat. She was not accustomed to this kind of care. She was not used to people being kind to her without expecting something in return. Thank you, Sophia, she managed to say in a quiet voice. Sophia just smiled and gently pushed her toward the bathroom. You should go get ready. We only have 2 hours left. 2 hours later, Isabella could hardly recognize the person staring back at her in the mirror. The black dress was a perfect fit, accentuating her warm skin and gentle curves. Sophia had helped her apply some light makeup, consisting of only mascara, a bit of blush, and a nude lipstick. Her long black hair had been styled into an elegant updo, which showed off her slender neck and the pearl earrings Sophia had insisted she borrow. You look absolutely beautiful, Sophia said, beaming with pride. Max is not going to be able to look away. Isabella felt a blush creep up her neck but did not say a word, instead taking a deep breath before she walked out of the room. The main staircase was already filled with people when Isabella appeared at the very top. She looked down at the hall, where hundreds of finely dressed guests mingled and sipped on wine. She saw a few familiar faces from the news, including powerful business leaders and politicians, and she assumed the rest belonged to the criminal underworld. This is Max's world, she thought to herself. A world of glamour and danger where she would never fit in. Just as Isabella started to walk down the stairs, Max looked up. His gray eyes found her instantly in the middle of the crowd, and he went completely still. She saw the wine glass stop halfway to his lips, saw his mouth open slightly as if to say something, but no sound came out. He was dressed in a black three-piece suit with a crisp white shirt and a black tie. He looked every bit the king in his own court. But in that one moment, when he met her gaze, Isabella did not see a cold mafia boss. She saw the man who had shared a glass of wine with her in the cellar, the one who had listened to her story without a single word of judgment. Max placed his glass on a nearby table. He walked to the base of the staircase and held out his hand like a true gentleman. "You are beautiful," he said, his voice unusually husky. Isabella put her hand in his, and she felt a wave of warmth travel up her arm. "Thank you for the invitation," she answered, fighting to keep her voice steady while her heart hammered in her chest. Max remained silent, simply guiding her toward the center of the hall. Every head turned in their direction. Whispers started to spread through the room, but Isabella paid them no mind. All she could focus on was the feeling of Max's hand holding hers, as if he were declaring to the entire world that she was his. Across the room, Vanessa Thornton stood in a crimson dress, her cold blue eyes burning with hatred as she watched. For the first few hours, the party was perfect. People moved through the crowd, laughing and talking. They savored delicate foods and sampled the best wines from the Castellano family's private collection. Isabella stayed by Max's side for most of the night. He introduced her to his business partners as a friend of the family. She caught many looks of curiosity and even surprise, but no one was bold enough to ask who she really was. Maxwell Castellano held too much power for anyone to question his decisions. Vanessa was there, of course, clinging to her father, George Thornton. He was one of the Castellano family's oldest allies. She never stopped sending hateful glares toward Isabella, but Isabella refused to let it affect her. She was accustomed to Vanessa's malice and would not let it spoil her evening. About halfway through the party, Max walked onto a small stage at the front of the hall. The lights in the room went down, a single spotlight landed on him, and a hush fell over the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," Max started, his voice resonating through the large space. "Tonight, it is my honor to introduce the new pride of the Castellano family, our Rosadoro line of wine, made from the finest grapes grown on our family's vineyard in Tuscany. But before we toast to Rosadoro, I want to offer you all something even more special. This is a bottle that has been stored in our family's cellar for 100 years. It has been waiting for an occasion special enough to be opened." Max gave a signal, and Tony appeared on stage. He held an ancient, dust-covered bottle that was protected inside a glass case. A wave of appreciative murmurs went through the room. They all understood the worth of a century-old wine, not just in its price, but in its history. Max gently uncorked the bottle. He poured a small amount into a crystal glass to check its color before he would taste it. Isabella watched from the floor as he held the glass up to the light, swirling it slowly. Then she saw the look on his face begin to shift. Max's brow furrowed. He lifted the glass to his nose, then took a tiny sip. His gray eyes grew dark, and his jaw clenched. Something was very wrong. Isabella's own heart clenched in her chest when Max set the glass down. His face was like a mask of cold stone. "The wine has been ruined," he said to Tony. His voice was low, but Isabella was close enough to the stage to hear him. Max's jaw was tight, but a flash of cold calculation appeared in his eyes. He had seen Vanessa on the security cameras hours before. He had let the sabotage play out. The truth was, the real 100-year-old bottle had been moved to his personal safe that afternoon. The bottle on stage was a fake. Max had set it there himself to bait Vanessa into his trap. He allowed her to destroy a worthless bottle. He created a public spectacle where he could expose the Thorntons for who they really were, and to show the world that Isabella was under his complete protection. Someone ruined it on purpose. Before the mood could get any worse, a sharp voice cut through the crowd. "I know who is responsible." Vanessa stepped out from the crowd, her face glowing with triumph. "I saw her," she declared, pointing a finger directly at Isabella. "The maid's daughter slipped into the cellar last night. She did something to that bottle." Every eye in the room swiveled to Isabella. She felt the blood drain from her face. A loud ringing filled her ears from the shock and rage. She had not done it. She was in the cellar with Max last night, but she never went near any of the bottles. "That is a lie," Isabella said. Her voice was firm, even as her entire world tilted on its axis. "I did nothing." Vanessa gave her a cold smile. "Is that so? Then maybe you can explain why you were down in the cellar at 2 in the morning." She spun around to face the guests, her voice rising with fake drama. "Everyone in this room knows exactly who she is. The daughter of a maid, whose own father stole from the Castellano family before he disappeared. Maybe being a traitor runs in her family's blood." The words felt like a physical slap across Isabella's face. Vanessa knew about her father. She had no idea how, but it did not matter now. Her deepest secret was exposed in front of hundreds of people, and there was no way to deny it. Some of the guests started to whisper among themselves. They shot her looks of suspicion and disgust. She was stranded in an ocean of strangers. A feeling of loneliness and desperation choked her. She wanted to scream that she was innocent, to tell them all that Vanessa was lying. But she knew that no one here would ever believe a person like her. Vanessa went on, her tone becoming more and more certain of her victory. "She is jealous of my place here. She wants to ruin the Castellano family to get revenge for her father. She needs to be thrown out of this house right now. Or even better, she should be punished the way the Castellanos handle traitors." Isabella looked up at Max, who was still standing on the stage in complete silence. His face was a blank canvas. His gray eyes were cool, watching the scene unfold, as if he were studying every single detail. She could not guess what he was thinking. She did not know if he actually believed Vanessa. She only knew one thing for certain. If he did, her life was over tonight. And in that moment, Isabella realized she was utterly and completely alone. Max's silence felt like it lasted for 100 years. Isabella just stood there, feeling like she was drowning under the weight of judgmental stares from every part of the ballroom. She wanted to run away, to vanish from this place entirely, but her feet felt like they were nailed to the marble floor. Vanessa was just a few feet away, a smug, triumphant smile spreading across her red lips. Behind her, George Thornton had a grim look on his face, clearly backing up his daughter's accusation. Isabella felt the room closing in on her. There was no way out. Then Max spoke, and it seemed as if the entire room held its breath. "Miss Thornton," he said. His voice was low and steady. It was as if he were talking about the weather, not a serious crime of sabotage. "You are saying you saw Miss Reyes go into the cellar last night?" Vanessa nodded with excitement, her blue eyes shining. She was certain that Max was taking her side. "Yes, I saw her with my own eyes. She went down into the cellar at about 2 in the morning. Who can say what she did to your family's valuable wine?" Max gave a slow nod, then signaled to Tony. Tony came forward with a tablet in his hands. He gave it to Max, who then turned the screen so the crowd could see it. "This estate is equipped with the most advanced security camera system available," Max said calmly. But there was a dangerous edge hidden beneath his words. "Every single corner of this house is recorded 24 hours a day, and that includes the wine cellar." Vanessa's expression started to change. Isabella watched the victorious smile disappear from her face, replaced by a flicker of sudden confusion. "This is the video from the cellar last night," Max continued, and then he pressed play. The screen showed black and white images from inside the cellar. Isabella watched herself walk down the stairs. She stopped when she saw Max sitting at a table in the back. She saw them talking, sharing a glass of wine, and then leaving the cellar together. Not once in the entire video did she touch a single bottle on the racks, other than the one Max had already opened for them. "But this is where it gets interesting," Max said, and he fast-forwarded the video. The scene changed to an empty cellar at 4 in the morning. Then, a figure appeared at the top of the stairs. It was Vanessa Thornton. Gasps and murmurs spread through the hall. On the screen, Vanessa crept down into the cellar. She glanced around to make sure she was alone, then walked straight to the wine rack. She took the century-old bottle, uncorked it, and poured a small vial of clear liquid inside. Then she put the cork back in, returned the bottle to its spot, and snuck away as quietly as she had arrived. "No!" Vanessa screamed. Her face was as white as a sheet. "That is not real. That video is a fake. You changed it just to protect that little tramp." Max set the tablet down. He stepped off the stage, and each footstep echoed in the now deadly quiet room. He walked through the crowd like a force of nature, and the guests scrambled to get out of his way. He came to a stop right in front of Vanessa, staring down at her with eyes as cold as ice. "You just falsely accused an innocent woman in front of all of my guests," he said, his voice low and full of menace. "You destroyed a bottle that was a part of my family's legacy, and now you have the nerve to use my name to ask for mercy." Vanessa started to shake and her knees buckled. Her father stepped forward, his face just as pale as his daughter's. "Maxwell," he started to say, "please, be reasonable. We can talk about this in private." Vanessa is still young. She did not realize the gravity of her actions. Max turned his head to face George Thornton, his gaze never flinching. "Mr. Thornton, I have great respect for the years our families have worked together, but I do not tolerate betrayal, and I do not care who it comes from. Take your daughter and get her out of my house this instant. We will discuss the consequences of this later." Tony and two other men came forward. They gently but firmly took Vanessa by her arms. She began to struggle, screaming curses. "She will pay for this," Vanessa shrieked, her eyes red and locked on Isabella. "She is nothing but a maid's daughter. She does not deserve to be standing next to you." Max did not even bother to look back at Vanessa. Instead, he moved to stand directly in front of Isabella, creating a human shield to protect her from every stare. He held out his hand. As if in a trance, Isabella placed her hand in his. In front of hundreds of guests, in front of the most powerful figures in the New York Mafia, Maxwell Castellano raised Isabella's hand to his lips. He placed a soft kiss on her knuckles. "Anyone who speaks ill of her speaks ill of me," he announced, his voice ringing through the silent hall. "And everyone in this room knows the price for defying me." Tears welled in Isabella's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She looked at Max, into gray eyes that held an emotion she was afraid to identify. She had no idea what her future would be. She did not know where this path would take her. All she knew was that right now, in a world filled with peril and deceit, she was finally not by herself. The party ended much later than planned. Yet no one spoke of the incident with the century-old bottle or the Vanessa Thornton scandal. The launch of Rosadoro was still considered a massive success. New deals were made, and the Castellano family's powerful reputation was as strong as ever. After the last guest had left, Isabella stood alone on the rooftop of the mansion, looking out at the glittering lights of the Manhattan skyline. She needed fresh air, needed some space to process everything that had just occurred. She heard footsteps behind her, and she knew who it was, without even turning around. Max came to stand next to her, and for a long time, they both just watched the city in silence. The night breeze carried a hint of autumn's chill, causing Isabella to shiver. Without saying a word, Max took off his suit jacket and placed it around her shoulders. Isabella wanted to say no, but the warmth felt too good, so she let it stay. "I need to apologize to you," Max said suddenly, his voice quiet and heavy with exhaustion. "I should have stepped in much sooner. I never should have let Vanessa take things so far." Isabella turned, surprised to see him. She had expected him to talk about the wine, the financial loss, anything but an apology. "You do not have to be sorry," she said. "You stood up for me in front of all those people. I did not think you would do that." Max looked at her, his gray eyes seeming to search her face in the faint light. "You thought I would just let them hurt you." Isabella paused. "I did not know what to think. I am used to fending for myself. I am not used to having someone stand in front of me. That way." Max went quiet and turned his gaze back to the horizon. His jaw was tense, as if he were fighting an internal battle. "I am not a good person, Isabella," he said, his voice raspy. "I have done horrible things. I have killed, I have tortured, and I have ruined countless lives." He held up his hands in disgust and continued, "These hands have been covered in blood more times than I can count. You should stay away from me." Isabella looked at him closely. She saw eyes that were filled with suffering and regret. She thought about her mother, who had spent 20 years living in the shadow of this family. She thought of her father, who had betrayed them and run away, and of her own scars, both visible and hidden. "I know who you are," she said in a soft voice. "I understand how dangerous your world is, but the real question is not about who you were in the past. The question is who you want to be in the future." Max looked at her, completely taken aback. "You are not scared of me. Scared of... You are not disgusted by the things I have done." Isabella moved a step closer, so near that she could feel his breath on her skin. I have spent so much of my life afraid," she confessed. "Afraid of my ex-husband, of my past, and of what the future holds. But with you," she searched for the phrase, "I do not feel afraid. I feel safe. And that feeling terrifies me more than anything." Max raised his hand, his fingertips tracing her cheek with a touch so light she barely felt it. "I do not deserve you," he breathed. Isabella covered his hand with her own, keeping it there. "We all have a past," she replied. "I am not here to judge. I see a man trying to be better, fighting his own darkness. That means more to me than any false perfection." Max watched her for a long moment, his eyes filled with emotions she had never seen. He leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to move away. Isabella did not. She lifted her face toward his. Their first kiss was tender and uncertain, like strangers learning a new path in the dark. Then he pulled her in, holding her like she might disappear, and the kiss deepened, becoming fierce and raw. She wrapped her arms around his neck, feeling his warmth, his heart hammering against his ribs. In that moment, everything else ceased to exist. No painful past, no uncertain future. There were only two people on a rooftop beneath the New York sky, holding on to each other, as if it was the only thing left in the world. When they finally broke apart, Max rested his forehead against hers, his breath a warm whisper on her lips. "I will not let anyone harm you again," he vowed, "whatever the cost." Isabella smiled, a genuine smile she had not felt in a very long time. "And I will stop running," she answered, "no matter how dangerous things are." They stood together in that embrace until dawn brushed the Manhattan skyline with pink. Two broken hearts had finally found a place to begin healing. The days after the party felt like a beautiful dream to Isabella. She and Max kept their relationship private. Still, everyone in the mansion noticed how different the model seemed. Change. The hidden glances, the brief touches as they passed each other in the hallways, and the long conversations on the rooftop that lasted until dawn. Sophia would beam with joy whenever she saw them together, while Maggie would just smile discreetly and act as if she had not noticed anything. Isabella started to think that she might have finally found happiness. That fortune was at last on her side, but one's past does not let go so easily. That afternoon, as Isabella was helping Maggie inspect the furniture in the main living room, Tony walked in with a tense look on his face. "Miss Reyes," he said, "there is someone at the gate who wants to see you." Isabella was taken aback. "Who is it?" Tony paused for a moment. "He says his name is Derek Manning, your ex-husband." Isabella felt as though she had been punched in the gut. The color drained from her face, and her legs suddenly felt weak. Derek. The name was like a curse, a specter from a past she believed she had left behind. How did he track her down? How did he know she was in this place? "Do not let him inside," Isabella pleaded, her voice trembling. "I do not want to see him." Tony glanced at Max, awaiting the order to remove the unwanted visitor. But Max's face showed no emotion. "Let him in, Tony," Max commanded, his voice dangerously calm. "If he was foolish enough to walk into the lion's den, I want to watch his face when he learns he will never walk out." A few minutes later, flanked by two armed guards, Derek Manning entered the room with a smirk that did not hide the coldness in his eyes. Isabella turned and saw Derek standing there, in the middle of the Castellano mansion's living room. He looked exactly as she remembered, tall with blonde hair and blue eyes, the same handsome face that had once charmed her. But now, all she could see was the cruelty hidden behind that charming smile. The monster who had ruined 3 years of her life. "How did you get in here?" Isabella demanded, her voice icy despite the panic rising within her. Derek just shrugged and stepped closer. "I have my methods. I heard you were working for the Castellanos, or maybe you are just sleeping with your new employer." Tony moved to stand in his way, but Derek held up his hands in a gesture of fake surrender. "Take it easy," he said. "I only want to have a word with my former wife." A wave of nausea washed over Isabella. "We have nothing to discuss. Get out." Derek shook his head, his smile twisting into something menacing. "Oh, I think we do. Have you mentioned our child to your new lover? Have you told him how you killed it?" Isabella froze, and tears welled up in her eyes. "No," she whispered. "Please do not." Derek moved closer, raising his voice so that everyone could hear. "She was pregnant with my child," he declared. "And she had an abortion because she did not want to have my baby. She is a murderer." "That is a lie," Isabella cried out, tears streaming down her face. "I had a miscarriage because you beat me. You kicked me in the stomach when I was 3 months pregnant. You are the one who killed our child, not me." A heavy silence filled the room. Tony stood frozen, his fists clenched tightly. Maggie brought a hand to her mouth, her face pale with shock, and in that moment, Max walked in. Isabella did not know how much he had heard, but a single look at his expression told her everything. He had heard the entire exchange. Max's face was like stone, but a fierce rage burned in his gray eyes. He walked past Tony, past Isabella, and stopped directly in front of Derek. "What did you say?" Max asked, his voice low and threatening. Derek's confidence wavered for a moment in the presence of the Mafia boss, but he tried to maintain his composure. "She is lying. She chose to have an abortion and now she is trying to blame me." Max remained silent. He stared at Derek for a moment, then turned to Tony. "Tony," he said in a frighteningly calm tone, "take Isabella outside. I need to have a private conversation with Mr. Manning." Isabella wanted to object, to stop Max from doing something he might regret, but Tony gently took her by the arm and guided her out of the room. The door shut behind them, leaving her trembling and crying in the hallway. Roughly 15 minutes later, the door swung open and Max stepped out. There was no blood on his hands, but Isabella could see fresh bruises on his knuckles. Behind him, 2 men were dragging Derek away. His face was swollen and bloody, but he was still alive. "He will never stand in front of you again," Max promised, his voice still cold, but his eyes softened as he looked at Isabella. "I offered him 2 choices. He could either leave this country and never return, or he could disappear in a different way. He chose the first option." Isabella looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "You did not kill him." Max shook his head as he gently wiped her tears away. "You asked me not to, that night in the cellar," he reminded her. "I honored my promise, but if he ever dares to come back, I will not be merciful a second time." Isabella threw her arms around him and sobbed into his chest. Max held her tightly, kissing the top of her head. The ghost that had haunted her was finally gone, and for the first time in many years, Isabella felt completely free. A week after the incident with Derek, a fragile peace settled over the Castellano mansion. Isabella's life found a new normal. She was no longer temporary staff but a guest of Max. Still, she could not sit idle and insisted on helping Maggie with chores around the house. Her mother, Rosa, had made a full recovery and was back at work. Max had eased her workload and given her a substantial raise in salary. It felt like everything was finally falling into its proper place. That calm shattered in the afternoon. Tony walked into the sitting room, his face grim. "Sir," he said to Max, "a man is at the gate. He is asking for Mrs. Rosa and Miss Isabella. He says his name is Ricardo Reyes." Isabella, who had been reading next to Max, went completely still. Then she heard the sound of glass breaking. Rosa was standing in the doorway, a tea tray smashed on the floor, her face as white as a sheet. "Ricardo," Rosa whispered, her voice a fragile tremor. "He is alive. He has come back." Max stood and put a reassuring hand on Isabella's shoulder. "Do you want to see him?" he asked in a low voice. Isabella could not find the words to reply. Her father, the man who had walked out on them 22 years before, the man who left her mother to drown in debt, the man she had despised her entire life was now at the gate, asking to be let in. She looked over at her mother and saw something in Rosa's eyes she did not expect. It was not hate. It was hope. "Let him in," Isabella said at last, her voice raw. "But if he hurts my mother again, I will throw him out myself." Tony nodded and left the room. A few minutes later, a man stepped inside. Ricardo Reyes was much older than he appeared in the photographs Isabella owned. His black hair was gone, replaced by white. His face was covered in lines and age spots. His body was thin and bent, as if he had been crushed by the weight of his life. But his dark brown eyes had not changed. They were the same eyes Isabella had, and they were now looking at his wife and daughter with an unbearable pain. "Rosa," he said, his voice unsteady. "My daughter." Rosa stood frozen as tears streamed down her face. Isabella took her hand, feeling her mother shake. "Why are you here?" Isabella demanded, her voice like ice. "After 22 years, you believe you have any right to stand before us?" Ricardo lowered his head, and his shoulders began to shake. "I know I do not deserve it," he said. "I abandoned my family. I forced you to suffer for my mistakes. I was a coward and a failure." He looked up, his face wet with tears. "Not a single day passed when I did not think of you. Not one night went by that I did not dream of Isabella as a little girl. I wanted to come back, but I was afraid. Afraid you would reject me. Afraid to see what I had done. For the past month, I have spent my nights standing in the shadows across from your apartment in Brooklyn, watching the lights in your window, and crying in silence. Too ashamed to step into the light until I knew I could truly seek your forgiveness. Then I heard that Miguel had died. I was not there when my son needed me the most. I knew I could not keep running." Isabella felt her anger fighting against something else she refused to acknowledge. She no longer saw a heartless traitor. She saw a broken man, destroyed by his own sins. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice a little softer. Ricardo dropped to his knees. "I am asking for forgiveness. I do not deserve it, but I am asking for a chance to atone, to make up for the years I lost." Rosa moved forward and knelt down beside him. She took his trembling hands in hers. "I waited so long, Ricardo," she said through her tears. "I was angry, but I never stopped loving you." Isabella watched her parents kneeling on the floor together and felt her own tears begin to rise. She was so tired of all the hatred. She knelt beside them. "I do not forgive you yet," she said with firmness, "but I will give you a chance to prove you deserve it. Do not fail my mother again." Ricardo looked up at her, tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. Max watched everything silently from the corner. He thought of his own father and accepted that family is never perfect. But he saw that with love and forgiveness, wounds have the power to heal. 3 months passed after the day Ricardo Reyes came back. Life had changed in ways Isabella had never dared to dream. Rosa was no longer a housekeeper. Max had promoted her to a new position managing all of the Castellano family's legitimate properties. It was a respected role with a salary that reflected her 20 years of service. Ricardo proved his transformation through his actions. He got a job as a carpenter at a shop near Brooklyn and came home on time every single day. He helped his wife cook and listened to the stories he had missed for 22 years. Isabella began a new job at a nonprofit that supported women who had survived domestic violence. She could use her own painful history to help others like her. She still lived at the Castellano mansion, but now she was openly Max's partner. Their relationship was a secret no more. That evening, Max invited the entire group to Rosa and Ricardo's small apartment in Brooklyn for dinner. Isabella was taken aback because Max always preferred to host gatherings at the mansion. He just smiled with a hint of mystery and said he wanted a true family dinner. The little apartment felt warm, filled with the aroma of Rosa's cooking, the sound of laughter, and a happiness that was entirely new to Isabella. Rosa and Ricardo sat close together, sharing gentle glances like a pair of newlyweds. Sophia flew home from university to be there. She sat next to Isabella and talked excitedly about her law studies. Maggie was there as well, smiling as she told stories from Max's childhood that made him blush. Tony stood in his usual place in the corner, but even he had a faint smile on his face. In the middle of the meal, Max stood up and tapped his glass lightly to get everyone's attention. "I have an announcement," he said, his voice warmer than Isabella had ever known it to be. "I have decided to go back to medical school to finish the degree I walked away from 5 years ago." The table was quiet for a second. Then Sophia cheered and gave her brother a hug. Rosa wiped away tears of joy, and Maggie nodded with deep satisfaction, as if she had been waiting years for this day. Isabella looked at Max, her heart swelling with pride. He was finally chasing his dream, the one he had buried along with his brother. "I will still be running the Castellano empire," Max continued. "But I have rearranged everything to make time for my studies. And more importantly," he turned to look at Isabella, "I am trying to build a future I can be proud of, a future I can share with the woman I love." Isabella could feel her cheeks getting warm as every eye in the room turned toward her. After dinner, while everyone was drinking tea and talking, Max led Isabella out onto the small balcony. The New York skyline glittered in the distance, but from here, they saw no shiny skyscrapers. They saw only the simple rooftops of Brooklyn, the world where Isabella had grown up. "Are you happy?" Max asked, taking her hand. "Happier than I ever thought was possible," she answered, resting her head on his shoulder. Max turned her to face him. His gray eyes were gentle and sincere, in a way she knew he saved only for her. "I am not perfect," he said. "I have done terrible things, and I may have to do terrible things again to protect my family. But you make me want to be better. You brought light into my dark world." Then he got down on one knee. Isabella gasped as he took a small red velvet box out of his pocket. Inside was an emerald ring surrounded by tiny diamonds. It was simple, elegant, and beautiful. "Isabella Reyes," Max said, his voice trembling. "I do not deserve you, but I will spend my life trying to. Will you marry me?" Isabella looked at the ring, then at the man kneeling in front of her. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this place. She had gone from a woman escaping an abusive marriage to someone standing on her mother's balcony, loved and cherished. She thought about her parents in the living room, about Sophia and Maggie, and about the family she had found where she least expected it. "Yes," she said, through tears and a bright smile. "I will." Max slid the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms. Their kiss was sweet and full of promise. Applause and cheers erupted from inside. They had all seen the moment through the glass. Sophia rushed out to hug them. Rosa cried with happiness in Ricardo's arms, and Maggie quietly wiped her tears with a handkerchief. That night, lying in Max's arms under a sky full of stars, Isabella realized that life truly could begin again. The defiant daughter of a housekeeper once stopped a mafia boss with her appearance alone. But what truly captured his heart was not her beauty. It was her courage, her honesty, and her unbreakable spirit. In his dark world, she was the only light he wanted to hold on to. Their story proves that true love can conquer any barrier, whether it is social class, a painful past, or the darkest secrets. This story offers many lessons: forgiveness, courage, love, and above all, hope. It shows that no matter how far life pushes us into darkness, there is always a path back to the light if we are strong enough to keep walking. Dear viewers, if this story touched your heart, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Like and share this video and leave your thoughts below. We thank you sincerely for watching, and we wish you health, peace, and happiness every day. Goodbye, and we will see you in the next video. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful stories and valuable life lessons.